right, peace, family. This is Davon Love, Director of Public Policy at Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. Thank you all for joining us this evening on this conversation around community reinvestment, around the issue of cannabis legalization. I know the conversation and the promotion for this, we talked about cannabis legalization, but the piece around community reinvestment is something that we think is going to be very important for legislators in the state of Maryland to get right. And so what we did was we actually invited two, sisters of ours who, are doing great work in Baltimore City, have a track record of doing great work in the city to help us talk about this issue of community reinvestment. So before I move forward, just want to welcome in, Shauna Murray Brand, Daniel Terrain. It's always good to have y'all, in good company and share stuff with us in the community. So it's good to see y'all. How y'all feeling this evening?
Good. Thanks for having us.
Good.
All right. So what I want to do first, before we jump into the conversation, is just do some framing for the discussion that we're about to have. So in the conversations around cannabis legalization, what has become mainstream is the conversation around mass incarceration and the way in which the damage that has been done as a result of mass incarceration is a part of the extension of racism and white supremacy. So we look at the way in which Black people in our communities have been, decimated in many regards as a result of mass incarceration. There's a recognition of that. And we're seeing in the mainstream a transition where policies to address mass incarceration have become more mainstream, particularly the progressive left has taken more of that up, which is a positive development. What has also happened is an increase in the mainstream conversation around reinvesting as a result of the damage that was done to Black folks. So not just dealing with the criminal justice implications of cannabis, which we're going to talk a lot about on Saturday. And so I want people to tune in on Saturday from 11 to 2 to our Black Legislative Agenda Day, where we'll talk more in depth, particularly about the criminal justice aspect of cannabis legalization. But again, the purpose of this conversation is to go deep because there's a recognition that there needs to be reparative justice, right, as a result of what's happened to Black people. And as a broad policy concept, I think most people would naturally agree. But the question is, how do we actually do community reinvestment in a way that is actually liberatory for Black people, right? And a lot of the conversations that have been had that see themselves as talking about equity have talked much about the business side of it. And again, that's something that we'll also address on Saturday during our Black Legislative Agenda Day. But the piece that LBS, as a matter of policy, is most focused on in terms of cannabis legalization is the tax revenues, right? So being able to leverage the public dollars that have come as a result of this new business and making sure, this new industry, and making sure that Black folks are benefiting from it. One of the things that LBS and our partners and the larger network of us doing work in the city have recognized for a long time is that the concept of developing community-based infrastructure is something that for a lot of people is rather abstract. And that the fact that there are folks who mean well, that provide services to our community, that in fact actually do more harm than good, is also another concept that I think for some people is rather abstract. Those two concepts, the importance of human infrastructure, right, so that the community has effective containers for receiving dollars, and being able to determine the kinds of programs to invest in that actually are liberatory to our community, for us are two essential aspects for effective community reinvestment. Otherwise, if we don't engage these two critical questions, then what will be touted as equity or community reinvestment will really just be an investment in the business model of Black suffering, right? Of people benefiting from the miseries of Black people, in the name of maintaining a colonial dependence that Black people have on the major institutions outside of our community, right? So that's the frame that I want to put to this. And again, that's why we wanted to go really deep on this concept, because this is something that we have to get right if we're going to say that we've achieved success legislatively in the state of Maryland, given the fact that the word is that cannabis is recreationally is likely to be legalized in the 2022 General Assembly. And so we wanted this to be an opportunity to educate legislators in the community about the importance of community reinvestment. So with that, I'm going to stop. So just to give the viewers just a format, how we're going to do this, I'm first going to pass it to Danielle Terrain, who is the executive director at OSI Baltimore. She's going to talk about aspects of infrastructure, human infrastructure, and go deep into that. Then I'm going to pass it off to Shauna, who's going to talk about the importance of liberatory approaches to wealth and health and wellness. And then we're going to have a conversation, the three of us, just to follow up on some of these concepts, and then invite you all to give your own questions to any or all of us in this conversation. So that's how we're going to rock it this evening. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it to Danielle to get started. The floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you, Davon, and hello, everybody. Thank you for
no, I think we got to do something with her sound. Does she sound distorted to you all?
Do I sound off?
Pretty good.
Sound okay? I'm good?
Okay.
Okay. Well, I just want to first say thank you for creating a space for this conversation. Davon, I really think you're right that we could do more to actually raise awareness of the importance of the conversation around infrastructure building, and also just building the skill around infrastructure building as we consider all of these different policy efforts, community change efforts. So I'm really looking forward to having this conversation with you guys tonight. I actually thought that as a starting point, we could do a little bit of grounding and some definitions and some core concepts. So I have a few slides that I'm going to go through pretty quickly. But as Davon said, after Shauna speaks, we'll open it up, and we're happy to do a deeper dive into anything that we share with you. First, it's helpful to actually talk about what we mean by infrastructure. This term has become almost like a term of art, just like capacity building, capacity support. We hear these terms, this language all the time, but not always clear about what we actually mean. When we say infrastructure, I want us to think about a web, a web of different structures, different capacities, different functions that help us to actually facilitate the process of getting to lasting and sustainable change. Next slide. When we talk about infrastructure, it's important to note that there are many different types of infrastructure. So each of us is actually a point of infrastructure. Our leaders in our community are the first and foremost, point of infrastructure, right? Like there are a level of capacity that we have in our communities. They move a lot of different things. And it's important to recognize that our families are also a point of infrastructure as well. On this slide, I've actually shared a few points of infrastructure that are often important to keep in mind as we have the conversation about public investment. So we have social change infrastructure, which is a definition that I've started with, just given the scope of this conversation. But we also can talk about physical infrastructure, which is more of like your bricks and mortars, your buildings, your sewage systems, your waste disposal systems. Community infrastructure refers to a range of different public assets that actually help us to be very strong and resilient and equitable as communities. National infrastructure, you see the example there of the US postal system, and even things like civic infrastructure, like our ability to volunteer, national service, things like that. So important to note that there are lots of different types of community infrastructure or infrastructure that's actually relevant to this conversation around community functioning and well-being. Next slide. So connecting the concept of community infrastructure to policy, I often get the question of like, what's the actual connection between the two, and why is it actually important to talk about this? First, public resources actually help us to do a lot of things. We know that public resources are often the most sustainable, the biggest dollars sometimes in many cases. And so, there's a point of building and maintaining public assets and infrastructure, promoting long-term economic growth, increasing community productivity and health and well-being through things like job creation. So public health resources actually help us to do a lot, but community infrastructure is actually the medium, the conduit through which we put public resources to work. And the glue that we actually need to actually turn progressive policy into implementation. When we lack a strong community infrastructure, it actually makes it difficult to attract those resources, to get those resources from their source into our communities, and to actually make an impactful use of those resources, whether it's public or private, investment. We see the cases of this every day. In the best case, public investment actually helps us to expand our community assets, build the strength of our infrastructure. But in the worst case, we've actually seen a lot of examples of large dollars being put in without attention to priming the actual capacity in our communities and organizations for that investment, and seeing it actually do a lot of harm. We see a lot of trauma, community level trauma, as a result of this pattern. So hopefully, as a result of this conversation and many others, we start to shift that tide, such that we bring that public and private investment into our communities, but on our terms, in a way that is more generative, and more and helps us to heal and build as a community. Next slide. So there's a concept I want to share with you guys, which is called absorptive capacity, which kind of gets to the last point I was raising around public resources and their capability to do a lot of good, but also the possibility of harm when not timed with our capacity. When we think about public investment, it is very important to gradually scale or time our public investment, or match our public investment with our actual capacity to absorb that investment. When you think about what absorptive capacity is, it's like a mix of skills and institutions and management capacity needed to bring those resources through and actually bring them to our organizations and our coalitions and leaders, and actually put them into work. So that means that we actually have to really focus on strengthening a range of capacities and institutions that are necessary to manage public investment. So it's not enough to just have the conversation about policy. That is definitely important, but it's also important to ask questions around, okay, what happens when we move into putting that policy to work? And what institutions do we have primed to actually be in position to receive the investment needed to implement on these policy recommendations. So weaknesses in the institutional framework to manage public investment results in a lot of different things that we've often seen, such as like payment delays and overwhelmed institutional capacity, upset community and stakeholder expectations as it relates to different initiatives, and then compromise impact. So these are some things to also keep in mind. Next slide. So the point here on this slide is just to say that the work of building and strengthening our capacity for investment filters all the way down from large structures, large systems, into our grassroots organizations and our homes even, and our individual leaders. So this slide is really just intended to show a range of different capacities that are important to keep in mind as we're building our kind of own house, and so to speak, as we strengthen our organizations. Capacity for investment requires a lot of different things, from the capacity for partnership in relation to other institutions, community institutions, from planning in administration, all the way through to like financial management and contract management and legal management and accountability. As we think about the work of building community infrastructure, it's important to keep in mind, think about all of those different professionals, lawyers, finance, professionals, accountants, that we also need in an aligned capacity to help to build to support our community's capacity for investment. Next slide. So with the next few slides, I just wanted to show a few examples of a real issue that we see in the space of community investment, and that is that longstanding racial disparities in investment in our communities has actually weakened our community infrastructure. And in order to be intentional about building community infrastructure, we have to apply a very intentional lens around racial justice and racial equity. Here on this slide, we actually see that, in a recent report or a recent research effort by the Urban Institute focused on Baltimore and what's called capital flow, we see that predominantly white neighborhoods receive more than 3 times the investment that majority Black neighborhoods received during this 13-year period. Next slide. This second example is specific to capital investment. So we're talking about, here we're talking about the program, the capital improvement program, which invests in things like parks and physical infrastructure, such as roads and sidewalks and water and sewer systems and public facilities. In this case, we actually find that neighborhoods whose populations are less than 50% Black in Baltimore received 4.5 times the capital investment of neighborhoods whose populations are more than 85% Black. Next slide. This next example shows another case, or another context, which is small business lending. So as we think about community-based enterprises, our businesses, and the importance of our small businesses, especially at the neighborhood level, we see the same pattern hold. In this case, neighborhoods whose populations are less than 50% Black receive 6.6 times the investment of those neighborhoods in Baltimore that were more than 85% Black. So you see this consistent pattern. Next slide. And last and certainly not least, I wanted to provide some data on what we see happening with Black-led organizations. And this data is more focused on the nonprofit sector, but a lot of these trends hold true across the board, whether we're talking about charitable organizations, nonprofit organizations, or even businesses. What we see nationally is as little as 8% of foundation capital, in this case, goes to people of color, with less than 1% to the Black community. And you see that trend even more compounded by gender, the lack of investment in Black leaders as being one example. You also see that on average, the revenues of Black-led organizations are 24% smaller than the revenues of their white-led counterparts. What this means is that, when you connect the issue of private investment with this issue of public investment, especially in a place like Baltimore, this means that a lot of times we're functioning without the unrestricted assets and the back-end capacities that we need in our organizations to really steward the big dollars and the big contracts and the big initiatives, right? So this is something that we're actually we have to pay attention to, this disparity in terms of where we are investing and really lift up our organizations and lift up this issue to make sure that we don't recreate these patterns as we move forward. Next slide. So last, before we transition to Shauna, I just wanted to provide a few thoughts on what do we do as we go forward. One, it's really important to promote infrastructure development. And by that, we mean intentional and proactive investment as a matter of good policy. So as we think about legislative efforts, it's really important to embed provisions that bring investment to communities of color, bring investment to institutions and businesses led by people of color in a just way, meaning that the level of investment matches the level of effort and the level of impact that these organizations are making. Also, as I said earlier, in order to counter these long-standing racialized patterns of divestment in Black communities, we have to ask some very intentional questions, like who is in line for investment, who has been excluded, as we think about who's in line for these large contracts and grants, at what level are different stakeholders supported. In the field of philanthropy, we often see this dynamic where you have large institution partner with smaller, more grassroots organizations that are actually anchoring and driving the majority of the work, but not paying them at all, or not paying them at the level that they deserve, or a level that's aligned with their actual contribution. So we have to ask, are resource allocations actually equitable and just? Have we sufficiently resourced all functions and capacities and contributions needed to really bring change or impact? Or are we kind of working on that shoestring budget? And are we really funding our contributors up to the agenda to really win, not just make it, but really win? And how do we actually promote this as a matter of good policy, not just goodwill? And then we also have to make sure that we invest in infrastructure development at every level. So again, thinking about people first, making sure that folks can take care of themselves as they take care of others. And then kind of working on up the chain in terms of the different types of institutions that we need in our communities to bring lasting impact. And so these are just a few thoughts to frame tonight's dialogue. And again, I'm happy to share more, answer questions a little bit later.
That was so. Can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Cool. Appreciate that, Danielle. Sorry for earlier. I was having some tech problems earlier, but I heard most of the presentation. That was dope. We're gonna transition to Shauna. So the floor is yours.
All right. So I'm always excited to talk about liberatory frameworks. The way that I am going to sort of hold the space for this reflection is really ground in my concepts of where these ideas came from, and then posit 6 inquiries for assessing anti-colonial liberatory interests. Next slide. So just to give some space for where I'm coming from when I'm talking about this concept or ideal of what it means to work from a liberatory perspective and what it means to function from an anti-colonial perspective, it's really important for me to locate myself and me to be crystal clear with you all around whose liberation am I talking about and anti-colonial for what, right? And so I am crystal clear, right, that my framing and the insights that I'm having is rooted specifically and poignantly in the concepts of Black liberation from the Black radical tradition and the like, that my identity and my experience of existing here in the United States of America as a Black woman here in the city of Baltimore is informing my framework of an understanding of what it means to ground from a liberatory perspective. And so when I'm talking about liberation, I am making a distinction between these concepts and ideas of what it means to be socially just or work for justice versus working for actual liberation. For me to be more clear here, my grounding and the way that I like to frame and articulate things is that freedom is individual. So that is our concepts and ideas of being able to make it in an individual level, and that might be our individual freedom, but we aren't free until we're all free. And so these concepts about liberation really has to do with what kinds of radical imagination, what kinds of movement forward is necessary in order for us to be able to demand and command a new way of existing, right? And so in order for me to hold the space for this, it also has to be fortified in this aspect of an ever-present community accountability. And so the way that I like to talk about community, y'all, I like to help us get real specific, right? So for me personally, right, we got Big C community. Big C community might be all of the state of Maryland, right? So all of the state of Maryland might be impacted by these conversations that we're having around community reinvestment, right? Little C community for me personally would be the city of Baltimore, right? And then we have village. Those are my individual and the depth of relationships. And so when I am talking about the importance of framing our ideas about what liberation is and how it differentiates from these ideas of social justice, that my accountability is coming from my village and actual people that I have deep relationship with in the city of Baltimore. Now, remember I said that I like to differentiate between social justice work and liberation work. Social, and this isn't to say that both aren't super important, but it is important for us to get clarity about what we're talking about and what we're seeing in the present landscape when we're having conversations about investment, about Black community, about transformation. In my view, social justice work literally works to address or to alter the current apparatus, the current system, the current structures of government that we're living within or under in order to make it less harmful. So when we're talking about harm reduction is super important. That is social justice work, very important. Liberation work, on the other hand, is that sort of forward thinking and radical imagination work around what would it be like if these systems didn't exist and what kind of infrastructure, as Danielle really powerfully articulated, what kind of infrastructure would be needed to be able to actualize another way forward. These insights are rooted in wisdoms from the past into the future. I'm grounding in ideas. Remember when I was talking about the Black radical tradition? So this is pulling from elder and ancestral teachings rooted specifically in from descendants of Africans enslaved here in the United States. And so when we're talking about the last thing on decolonial and anti-colonial orientation, I do want to demystify these concepts of decolonial and anti-colonial orientation as so that when I'm reflecting on some of these other ideas, we can be really clear. So what it means to decolonize, it literally means to repatriate land and life. That is to give back, right? That is to seek to undo the harms that have been imposed centuries ago onto Black folks and Indigenous folks and other folks of color here in the United States. And so when we're talking about working from a decolonial praxis, or when we're talking about doing things that invite decolonization ideals and activity, we're talking about what do we need to shatter, what do we need to recreate so that we can undo the harms done by colonial systems. What it means to be anti-colonial is to be against anything that is colonial, right? And we'll talk more about those frameworks in a moment, but I think it's really important for us to get clear here. You may also hear folks talk about decolonization from the perspective of centering in shifting from European or white frameworks of the world and worldview, and shifting to more indigenous African ways of knowing and value system. More about that later. Next. And so I want to start, right. I want to shift into why this conversation of community reinvestment even matters. Now, Danielle set a really powerful foundation for what happens when we decide that when we decide to have this conversation, what has been happening thus far without this conversation about community and reinvestment. And what we know is that the things that we've been doing, the things that society, human service infrastructure, systems of philanthropy, policy structures, the things that we've been doing do not work, right? That they effectively uphold racism and white supremacy, and that we are so focused in on the theory and the conversation around what it means to do things in a way that might be anti-racist or against racism, but we are really unclear what it actually looks like to ground in actual praxis. And this impacts individuals, and it perpetuates families and communities. More specifically, when we're talking about the impact of that a lack of community reinvestment has had in Black community, what we see is all of the data that Danielle already articulated. And the way that shows up in the individual is a marked perpetuation of race-based trauma for Black folks in the state of Maryland, and especially in the city of Baltimore. When we're talking about where funds go to, we need to get clear, right, on whose community, how are we defining community, and who gets to decide what frames of liberatory praxis are valid, right? And so community reinvestment matters, and because harm from the status quo may be perpetuated without it. If we don't get clear on the kinds of questions we need to be asking ourselves when we are talking about liberatory frameworks and the like, then we will find ourselves and our children 25 years in the future asking some of the same questions that our ancestors were asking 20 years ago, right? We need to get clarity around and have the eyes to see how this shows up. I think that we do need to redefine community, right? And that's why I think that it's important for when we're talking about liberatory praxis to actually get grounded in the detail that I'm going to share in the next slide. Next slide. All right, so what I have here are 6 inquiries for assessing anti-colonial and liberatory interests. And I'm going to talk through each of them Please keep connecting with me, y'all, in the comments. And so these are questions to ask when we're talking about programmatic implementation. These are questions to ask when we're talking about policy implementation. These are also questions to ask when we're talking about like what organizations are going to get funding, right? How are we assessing it? What kind of questions should we be placing at the center? And so the first is, does the policy or the program or initiative seek to resolve a challenge that's been posited by the community served, right? So that is, once we define community, so here I'm talking about Black Baltimore, okay? So we're talking about Black Baltimore, and then we expand that into all Black folks in the state of Maryland. What does the community actually have to say about some of the challenges that are being experienced as a result of the investment in the incarceration of their communities, about the lack of opportunity for investment in infrastructure, about the struggles with the development of Black business and grassroots level initiatives, right? What does the actual community have to say? And so if the policy or the program and initiative isn't resolving a challenge that has been posited by the community served, or that is, if you or the entity or institution that you are working within hasn't actually spent time listening to what people in the community actually have to say, it is not working for liberatory interests, because we need to be centering at like the grassroots voices of those that we're seeking to serve. The second question I have here is, does the policy, program, or initiative seek to contribute to the destruction of present colonial systems? That's the first part, and or offer space for Black sovereignty or self-determination. So let's break that down a bit, right? So what we understand is that the current apparatus that we are existing in and having to navigate is the child of the mature child of a perpetual a present day colonial structure, right? And so if the policy, program, or initiative is not effectively seeking to shift where the power is located and ensure that the ideological basis of the organizations and the systems that are being affected aren't trying to destroy the current programs and systems, then we are actually not working, we're not supporting a liberatory endeavor. And when I'm talking about liberation here, we're talking about the self-determination for Black and brown folks, right? We're talking about the ability for Black folks to be able to say what they'd like to have and would like to exist, to build within society and societal structures, and the ability to be able to make that happen. And does it offer space for Black sovereignty or self-determination? That is, when we're talking about cannabis legalization, right? If we were talking about how to actually put into place a easy way for Black folks to be able to participate in this business structure, how are the structures being designed that center the needs of Black folks? How are the leadership opportunities or training opportunities, how the infrastructure that Danielle talked about being created in a way that allows Black folks to be able to express and articulate exactly what it is that they need, and to ensure that policies are in place to be able to protect it. Number three is, can it contribute to the act of decolonizing? What we're talking about here is, can the policy or the program contribute to the ability of Black folks not having to rely on white infrastructures and systems to be able to ground, right? Like, can it contribute to the ability for Black folks to be able to have their own institutional structures separate from, without having to ask permission for philanthropic sort of entities that might otherwise have the power. And it's important that when we're talking about this, that it is important for us to remember that we're not talking about something that will happen in a year or 2 years, right? But we should be thinking about our programs and our policy development from a perspective of, over the next 10 or 15 or 20 years, what steps need to be taken from a policy perspective and a programmatic perspective, so that the power structures that uphold racism and white supremacy step back as Black folks are able to step in to a space of self-determination. Number four, does the policies creation and the program implementation center to the axiology or the wisdom of the community served? You might be like, Shauna, axiology, what are you talking about? We're talking about worldview. We're talking about value systems, right? Put simply, we understand that in the society that we're currently navigating, everything is grounded in a Eurocentric worldview, or we talk about white supremacy culture here, the value in numbers, right? The value in data that can be seen and counted and tangible, for example. Whereas if we centered or grounded in a more African-centered or Black value system, then we would be valuing story. We would be valuing things that are intangible. We would be bringing in the space of the wisdom of our elders and ancestors to be able to guide in the creation of the policy and the program, right? So without creating a space so that the kind of infrastructure that is being invested in can be fortified in these value systems, we are not working for a liberatory interest. So number five, does it acknowledge historical and systemic context of oppressions? What are we talking about here? We're talking about Black folks, Black men, Black women, Black trans and non-binary individuals. We're talking about folks being incarcerated and families being shattered and destroyed as a result of the criminalization of cannabis. We're talking about the cultural orientation and relationship between the connection of a plant, and we're talking about many policies and programs being implemented without acknowledging the long-held harms that have existed. So, and when we are creating policies and programming, when we're putting funding in place, what spaces are being provided to allow an opportunity for healing the historical harms that have been done systematically and have trickled down generationally into the community. Space has to be allowed for that if we expect actual humans to be able to actualize anything transformative. And the last here is, are the benefits of the policy or program accessible to the population it seeks to support? So in preparation for this experience, I did a little Google search. I tried to do some research to see what other cities might be doing something, particularly radical in their implementation of the legalization of cannabis, right? And what I found is that oftentimes, institutions, the policies that were written would center sort of marginalized populations as a whole, and minorities centering women. And what we know from much data is that oftentimes when we make a broad stroke around diversity, that oftentimes those those that have these intersectional identities, white women, right, or cisgender heterosexual population that might also have this sort of person of color identity, that the resources still don't get to Black folks. And so the benefits of the policy or program need to be particularly specific to Black folks in order to ensure, right, that these transformations are allowed to be actualized. And so these are inquiries that we need to be asking ourselves when we see policies come across and we are supposed to be advocating or supporting LBS and other institutions that are really grounding in a liberatory praxis. We need to be asking ourselves and assessing in this way. The last thing that I'll say here, though, is that white institutions tend to make their investments not recognizing that you could be Black in leadership at a white institution and embodying and still employing white value systems, right? That it takes another level of work to be able to interrupt some of the socialization that the Black folks have endured, even in the leadership to support Black people. And so we need to be putting forth questions like value systems. We need to be asking questions about historical trauma when we are having these conversations about liberatory interests. And that's it. Oh, that's fine.
So appreciate both of you for laying all of that out. And again, I just want to reiterate that, while the community is always certainly the broader audience for this, particularly those in the policymaking space, because when conversations come up about reallocation of resources, this is a place where I think there's the least amount of sophistication in many of those major policymaking spaces. So I want to do first, I actually have a couple of questions that or statements I want y'all to react to just to expound on what you talked about. A few things I want to highlight though before we do that. The first is that in the policy around reallocating the revenues for cannabis legalization, one of the things that LBS has talked a lot about is the importance of making sure that those revenues go directly to communities impacted by the war on drugs. And one of the dynamics that we've seen around the country is that many of the major nonprofit entities, when they see the coming legalization and they know that there's a larger sentiment around addressing the harms that have been created as a result of marijuana prohibition and the war on drugs, you have major institutions, mostly white-led and certainly not liberatory in many cases, that position themselves as experts on the question of reinvestment. And so one of the things, and I'm kind of skipping ahead, I'm gonna get to some questions that folks have posed after I kind of expand on some of the things that Sean and Danielle have talked about. But one of the questions that talked about what other states have done, and one of the reasons why this particular talk is so important is because what other states have done is that the side of the reinvestment piece or the social equity piece, as other states have termed it, have taken the direction from traditional major white-led nonprofit philanthropic entities that don't talk about the importance of building infrastructure and that do not have a liberatory approach in terms of selecting the kinds of programs that would be reparative for Black people in dealing with the damage of the war on drugs. And so one of the things that's going to be very important this coming session is in our continued conversation about reinvestment, making sure that the community is clear that in our advocacy around the reinvestment portion, that we don't have a particular stance just because, we have a particularly strong opinion, but that the perspective that we're taking is one that if we actually want the dollars to get to the community, and if we actually want it to have an impact, this part of the conversation is going to be particularly important. And this leads me to the first, kind of question/statement, Shauna and Danielle, that I would like y'all to react to. So in previous sessions, when LBS has posed this concern as it relates to cannabis legalization, one of the things that happens is that, and legislators who are well-meaning, right? So because many of the folks who are sponsors, of cannabis legalization tend to be more on the progressive realm, right? And so a lot of times in those conversations, when it comes to this question of reinvestment, it's usually the response is usually something like, yeah, we're going to give money to schools, we're going to do drug treatment, we're going to give money to reentry, all the things that again sound good, right? But as people who are rooted in liberatory practice understand that there are additional concerns in terms of deciding where resources go, right? That from a policymaker's perspective, it's a lot easier to just be like, oh, give it a drug treatment, give it the it's a lot easier just to do that. So if you could both speak from your particular perspectives that you spoke from tonight, why is it important, like the energy that it takes to say to a legislator, we got to go further? Like, I get that from a policymaker perspective, it's easier to say the kind of standard stuff. How would you, from your perspective, encourage a legislator to say, look, we have to actually go further on this question of how the reinvestment happens in order to make sure that it goes in a way that's actually going to have a meaningful impact? How would you approach that conversation?
Well, I think like as a person who spends a lot of hours training and consulting the very institutions that you just articulated that folks would like to funnel funds to, they're coming to me to figure out how to undo the harm that they've contributed to. So one of the first things that I would bring to the fore is let's look at the data around some of the harm that has been perpetuated in the mainstream sort of frameworks around drug treatment, and let's talk about the ways in which capitalist interest has been fortified and in these realms, even these ideas of who's being helped. And so the first thing is I would just pull up some data, right, to help them sort of get a framework for, oh, okay, so you mean to tell me that that addiction actually hasn't like gone down and that overdoses are still gone up, and that the programs that have been I actually published an op-ed in the Baltimore Sun a few months ago about this very topic, right? About the fact that even the drug treatment programs are rooted and uphold racism and white supremacy. And so I would just show the data there, and then I would do a scan on Collectively's website, and do a scan of some of the Black therapists that I have trained in liberatory praxis that are doing work in drug treatment, to sort of invite their reflection around what does it look like to have a long-term investment strategy that utilizes some of the grassroots initiatives that data has shown could be better implemented if folks from the actual community were seeking to solve the problems, as opposed to white infrastructure and apparatus and leaders that are embodying internalized supremacy and anti-blackness, so they can move to the side.
So I'm actually a quick follow up on that, just
Okay.
to reiterate. So just in terms of the question, because again, for legislators, policymakers, it's easier to kind of, let's just do drug treatment, let's just do reentry, right? And just give it to any program, and the assumption that that in and of itself is positive. And so a part of, just for the viewers to just understand the question, and kind of what I'm hoping for folks to get is from Danielle and Shauna. What would you say to a policymaker whose impulse is to say it's the easiest thing? Let's just invest in the things that's the easiest thing, to encourage them to go a bit further, to recognize how important it is to really take the reinvestment part seriously. My quick follow up though, Shauna, because you mentioned like some of the institutions that folks will funnel money to are folks that have been engaged with in conversations about their practice. And I think for many policymakers, I don't know that many of them understand the extent to which many of these service providers have been abysmal and problematic in the delivery of those services. So could you say a little bit more about that? Because again, it's one of those things where, when legislators in Annapolis and folks are testifying in front of them, they're going to hear from agency heads that'll talk about all the good things they do and the people that they serve. So I know for a lot of legislators, it'll be jarring for them to hear, you or anyone say that actually is problematic. So could you say just a little bit more about just the extent to which many of these services actually are not having the impact that legislators may think are being had because of who comes before them and what they say they're doing?
So I think that I would ground it in how success is measured. And that success in a drug treatment program is how consistent a person is, or how like, are they being compliant with their methadone treatment, right? And so I would have to bring in some information about the how methadone treatment and folks, Black families who are on long-term methadone treatment, how it actually still contributes to the disintegration of Black family, right? So I would have to pull out multi-layered experiences there. I would also have to really educate folks around the fact that everything that any social worker or psychiatrist, case manager has learned in the white institutions, or even Black institutions, have been rooted in and grounded in a Black inferiority and anti-Black racism. And so if we say that the success rate for a drug treatment program is how long have you been on your methadone program, and not have you actually been able to live the life that you desire, those are different questions that need to be asked. And so I would have to sort of juxtapose it there, that these programs are not successful because they are not bringing about the definition of success that Black families and folks that actually struggle with addiction would articulate as success. The last thing that I'll say here is, as a doctoral student, we actually just did a study, right? We're writing the paper right now about the experiences of women in methadone treatment. where we thought we were going to focus in on how consistent they were at taking their methadone and the success and the happiness that they experienced from that. But really, what they talk about is how much they want to get off methadone and how oppressive that those actual systems are, and how they wish that they were being provided alternative ways to be able to heal from addiction that weren't just feeding into the medical industrial complex.
So, all right, thank you for that. Danielle, you want to jump in?
Sure. So, Shauna, on this note of how we define success, I would also say that we should also be honest about even by the standards that we currently hear in the sector, we are failing desperately. So I'll give the example of workforce development in Baltimore and job creation. In that space, we invest a lot of money in organizations that are purposed to help folks to find a job, help you to sustain a job, entering the workforce, staying in the workforce, moving up, right? Very basic standards. When we actually look at what data we already have, we see that folks aren't entering into the workforce, folks aren't staying in the workforce, right? But we're not getting to that next conversation about like why and going to communities themselves and folks that we are intending to serve to say, okay, what's the problem here? When we talk to our young people, when we talk to formerly incarcerated individuals, when we talk to folks who've decided to step out of the world of work, they will tell the story that we need to hear. For example, what's happening with women of color in the workforce right now, what's happening with young people, what's happening with folks who have an entrepreneurial skill set that find themselves funneled into training programs that say that the only end that you can ever imagine for yourself is a kind of a dead end job, kind of low income work, right? So we see that in many cases in the sector, a lot of the programmatic approaches that we consistently support just aren't working, but we're not getting to that honest conversation that we need to push for. So that's one thing. The other point that I would raise is that, again, as we think about the structure of policy and the opportunity before us, as we think about legislative efforts, the importance of supporting space for planning and development. So we'll hear a lot of language around a planning grant, a developmental grant, right? Really what that is, and what the reason why it's really important to request those types of resources is that often what we know as leaders in community is that we need some space to plan. Like when you have an opportunity for a large investment, a lot of times we'll like jump in and feel pressured to just kind of like, do what they call like just be shovel ready when we aren't. And when we need the opportunity to really drop back, and as Shauna has said, reimagine what the actual approach might be, reimagine what our institutions, the institutions that may anchor the approach, can and should look like, right? So it's also about really thinking carefully about the types of resources that we're even requesting and being bold enough to say, you know what, we need to drop back and actually think and plan and strategize and create those more restorative spaces where we can actually think ahead, right? And think about the long game, but then put these specific kind of initiatives and efforts into that longer context. So those are some notes that I would share as well.
Cool. So, so what I want to do quickly, I'm gonna address some of the questions that have to do with the legislative piece, and then I'm gonna ask y'all a follow-up question. So I'm seeing questions about like one question in terms of how does this deal with the current reality of people that are in jail right now? So as I mentioned at the top, on Black Legislative Agenda Day on Saturday, we're going to talk about the
Hey, Dave, I don't think your microphone is on. Nope, your microphone's not on. Nope. Nope. Well, while we're dealing with this technical difficulty right now, I just want to remind you that it is currently Giving Tuesday for Leaders of the Beautiful Struggle, and that you should donate right now to become a sustainer. You should become a sustainer or donate a one-time gift for our organization. We're doing this talk tonight because part of the work that we do in the state legislature during the Maryland General Assembly is that we advocate for these issues. So we're not just talking at you on a Tuesday night in the middle of and the end of November, beginning of December, just because we feel like it. We're doing this to educate you about what's happening next in the upcoming legislature and to also inform you on how to get involved. And so this talk, if you see the link over top of my head right here, lbsbaltimore.com/sustain, you can become a sustainer today and fund the fight for Black liberation here in the great city of Baltimore and in the state of Maryland. So while you're watching this, the 50 or so y'all on YouTube, go to, you can, if you got YouTube Premium, you can exit YouTube and still listen right now and become a sustainer all at one time. That's all I'm saying. You know what I mean? So become a sustainer today. Thank you very much. Dave, you got your mic back on? Because
Yeah, I'm good. I'm good.
there
Yeah,
you
my
go.
tech
Become a
been
sustainer,
wild
y'all.
today. Yeah. So as I was saying before, the Black Legislative Agenda Day, we're going to do a lot of the criminal justice aspects. I saw someone that mentioned, how does this deal with folks that are in jail presently? And one of the things that will be included in legislation that we advocate for is opportunities for resentencing. There are lots of folks for whom the basis of their charges had to do with marijuana consumption being the basis of the probable cause. So we're going to be making sure that that's something that's a core part of our advocacy. So I didn't, we're not focusing on that tonight, but I wanted to make sure to address that so people know that's going to be a big part of what we're pushing for. And then I just saw a few questions just around the legislators, like the actual legislation. Is it being written up? Who's going to be moving it? Last year, Delegate Jazz Lewis out of Prince George's County was carrying a bill on the House side. Senator Feldman was carrying it in the Senate side. Delegate Jazz Lewis's bill, was considered to be the more progressive of the two. He's not going to be sponsoring his bill this coming session, but will be heavily involved in helping to push legalization in the direction. We actually had a conversation this morning, and so he's kind of pledged his support around making sure that a lot of the things that we're talking about are things that are included. But he won't be sponsoring it. We're actually, LBS and our partners at the ACLU are actually working with legislators currently to draft a piece of legislation and working with other advocates as well. So we're actually going to be meeting with other advocates who have been working on cannabis legalization to make sure that we're all in agreement and can be, pushing a collective message. A part of the reason why this particular conversation around community reinvestment is so important is because we're going to emphasize these points around community investment that we talked about today as essential elements to any bill that passes the Maryland General Assembly. Because what we don't want to do is we don't want a bill that gets passed that gets touted as dealing with the questions of racial justice that in fact does not. And there are lots of well-meaning people, both in Maryland and around the United States, that have attempted to deal with this question of equity, but have dealt with it in a way that still has many of the limitations that come when you don't center on the conversations that we've talked about tonight in terms of liberatory frameworks and building infrastructure. Again, I want to emphasize that those are the two places where, as a matter of policy, those things are most absent from. And we've actually had conversations with people in other states. So in California, we were actually told that that meant that the reinvestment efforts, in order for them to be most responsive, it required community to actually pressure state government to make sure dollars went in the places that it needed to go, and that it's a struggle because it required just a level of oversight from community to pressure dollars to go where it needs to go. And that there has been a general consensus that in the initial planning of how they legalized it, that they got it wrong, right? One state that I do want to mention that I think is particularly important is in Illinois. They have a model where they've established a state board, and what they've done is, in terms of some of the members that they've that they put into law that would serve on the state board that would allocate and dispense resources, they have categories like folks that have been formerly incarcerated, folks that are most directly impacted, right? That's a gesture, right, to, I think, what we're talking about in terms of proper community reinvestment. The problem is that merely having a representative on a state board does not address the infrastructure question, because it doesn't address the community's ability to be able to receive the dollars and execute, and it doesn't address the issue of having a liberatory framework, right? That we don't want to be investing, in the kind of methadone approaches to drug treatment that Shauna mentioned. That's something that those are things that have to be considered. So even the states that have attempted to address this concern, the consistent gap has been on the very issues we're talking about tonight. So again, that's why we're spending so much time focusing on this concept. And then I saw a question before around has the legislation for, no, that's not it. There was a question around requiring regular community reinvest. Oh, I found it. So this is from Michelle Smith. Has this been addressed in a political level by requesting on a regular basis to have a policy of redirecting tax revenues from cannabis sales to the Black communities in particular? So this question is particularly important because because of the, as Danielle mentioned, the lack of investment in infrastructure, the ability on a policy level to actually do that is extremely limited, right? So that's something that, again, we're hoping to make sure is addressed, is that if we build the infrastructure, it provides a mechanism to make sure that actually gets addressed. Otherwise, there are going to be a bunch of investments in big, major white-led nonprofit entities, and that's going to be characterized as investments in our community. And that's going to be, certainly missing the mark. And then the last question the last question I'll address before I go back to Shauna and Danielle. There's a question of how artists, creatives, entrepreneurs can benefit from this and support this legislation. So one of the things that we have advocated for, that in terms of how we want the bill to be drafted, is that we want the bill to be drafted in a way where the jurisdiction, so there would be a formula that would use arrest rates, right, historically, and that those arrest rates due to marijuana would be used to develop a formula to determine which jurisdictions were most hit hardest, and that the percentage of the revenues assigned would go to the jurisdictions based on the level of impact that this has had on those jurisdictions, and that those local jurisdictions, through their local legislators, their local county or city councils, would determine where those resources are spent. And there are a lot of people who, when I say that, they say, well, we don't trust the government, we don't trust the city council, and why would you send it there? The reason that this has been the perspective that we've come to this with is because, unfortunately, there is no other public body that a person can pressure that's superior to what the council can offer in terms of a mechanism of community pressure, right? What in many cases, when there are local mandates, in many cases, when there's statewide legislation, it goes just through the executive, right? And the executive gets to just make the determination in terms of allocation of resources and policy. But at the very least, if it requires the local legislature to be a part of the process, at the very least, it provides the public an opportunity to weigh in on their local legislators that they're more accessible to. It allows them to be able to put pressure in shaping what the jurisdiction does. And what we'll also advocate for is there will be guardrails. So it's not like they're going to be given the money and be able to do what they want. It's going to, we're going to say, for instance, no money to law enforcement, because there are other states from which some of the investments, the revenues have gone to law enforcement. So we're going to say no law enforcement. We're also going to say that they have to demonstrate that the activities being funded is responsive to the damage done as a result of the war on drugs, right? So those are a few examples of guardrails, and we're still working on the exact language, but those are examples of some of the guardrails that we're going to put in making sure that local legislatures are able to come up with something where they're being required to be responsive to the community and making sure that those dollars go back into the community. So that's, just in terms of the legislative aspect of it, just wanted to draw that out. Let me just another follow up, Danielle and Shauna. one of the things we've talked about informally is just the way that the term equity has been thrown around a lot, right? Racial equity is something that's been thrown around a lot. And I think as a result, a lot of states, as I mentioned, have had or tried to have a equity aspect of their cannabis legalization efforts. And in many of the equity efforts, there's been an attempt to characterize many of the more traditional modes of investment, right, as racial equity, right? And so one of the things, and like, as I mentioned, as I've had to say to legislators, like, we have to go a little deeper. And so so just from both of you all's perspectives, if you were having to coach a legislator to understand, like, when someone says equity, right, what are the kinds of things they should be looking for if they're trying to match the perspective that we're coming with, right? The perspective we're coming with that's rooted in liberatory practice, that's rooted in community empowerment, that if someone is coming them with the term equity, what kinds of things should they be looking for? What kinds of questions they should be asking folks that are coming to them saying they have an approach that takes this notion of equity into consideration?
So I can start. It is very true that, like, the term equity has just become another one of those terms of art. Everybody says it now. But it is really important to really drill down. To me, when we talk about equitable approaches to community investment, we're really talking about, at its heart, it's about shifting power and control over resources. So if we're not talking about, who's in a position of not just making the decision, but conducting the analysis, like, who are they consulting with? Are they really rooted in the communities that are most impacted by that point of investment? And then also, when we consider, like, what institutions, what organizations we're investing in to do the work, and then I understand in this context, we're also talking about businesses as well, who is not just in the kind of the front role, sometimes like the ED or the kind of director of that organization, but who's on the board, like, who's really making the decisions, like, who's at every level of leadership, and are they truly reflective of and rooted in the community that is being served? So what often makes folks uncomfortable about this conversation is that, like, we're okay with talking about equitable approaches until it starts shifting who's in the seat to make the decision and who has control over where resources go and on what terms, right? But unless we're seeing that shift take place, like, we're really not rooting ourselves in an equitable approach. And then, as Shauna said, is really about liberatory approaches, which is like an entirely different standard, a different frame of kind of understanding, like, what we're investing in, why, and on what terms. So I'll start there by just adding that element of thinking about, like, who's in a position of power, who's in a position of control, watching what institutions are a part of the kind of mix of the investment mix, so to speak. So often you will have one organization that is at the lead, but then other organizations or entities that are in a secondary role that are not being resourced. So also looking for some of those dynamics as well. I'll pause there for Shauna to be able to jump in.
Yeah. So what's coming up for me, and it's a really challenging thing that I found for really everybody to be able to apply, is that, remember earlier when I was talking about the way that we've been socialized to ground and to really make it so that, you have a widget, 1 + 1 = 2. This is the way you do it the same way each time. And so that idea of having a fixed perspective and protocol for how to do things and how to make decisions is powerfully challenged when we start talking about these concepts of equity. And so I would really want to coach this person in thinking about, like, even the simplest challenge of, access to a training program, right? Let's say a training program around cannabis dispensing, if that was a business that someone in Baltimore, we wanted to ensure that Black folks had the opportunity to be able to gain access to those kinds of resources. Let's say the application for processing is $1,000, let's just say. right? So the access to the application is for $1,000. But what we're finding, let's say, is that 75% of the folks that are applying are white men and women. And we just can't figure out why, because we have Baltimore, okay, and there's not all these black people here. All right. So then so let's say, we ask some questions of the folks in the community, and they're like, listen, I $1,000 is a grit. Like that's a lot of money. I would coach this person to sort of begin to think about all of the different ways that an institutional organization or a person making decisions would have to adjust the possibility or the galleria of options of how they might make space for Black folks to be able to gain access. It could be we need to add childcare in the back or next door so that the Black parents can get access to this thing, and we need to make it so that it is 50% or 50% off, or maybe it's completely free if you fall into that percentage, Davon, that you talked about. So when we're asking, so I would really try to break it down to how challenge. I would want to demystify the level of challenge the institutions and organizations actually have, and actualizing equity and praxis, because we understand it from whether or not the numbers show it, but that is a challenge. So that's the first thing. The second thing that I would want to ground in is really this concept of that Danielle, that you mentioned earlier, about are they really connected to community. And so that might mean that this legislator, this person would need to be asking questions like, help me understand what community actually is. When you say community, who do you mean? What grassroots level organizations have you worked with over the past 5 to 10 years? If I go into this particular neighborhood and I ask for a person that is known, in this particular way, what name will come up? And so that is really getting into the tangibilities of the kinds of questions to ask, where if people start stumbling over, oh, I really can't name any of those, I'm not really sure, or I have to Google that. That might also help folks to really understand, like, when we're talking about equity, we're not talking about just a checkbox of how many Black folks do we have, how many folks in the LGBTQIA community do we have, but also when we're talking about representative, right? Like, what is the lived experience and what level of connection do they have outside of the offices and not necessarily connected to these academic institutions? And then I would also just challenge the notion altogether that we should start with established white institutions, even if the leaders are Black. And I think that rubs people the wrong way sometimes, but it is the truth. We need to start adding in some sort of mechanism, whereas it's like, are you employed by a large white institution? Okay, so how can we privilege those that actually are not? And what do we make of that, or the lineage history that they had in their own personal impact of the war on drugs in their family?
Davon, can I also make a quick note?
Yep.
Just on, because I know at least a portion of our audience may be like kind of rooted in the space of policy or politics, when you are in the position of trying to advocate for a different approach to policies, and especially around this particular issue. And what we know is that in the political kind of domain, often there's a lot of pressure to win, right? Like, so that pressure to win in that frame often causes us to rush to frameworks and solutions that actually do more damage than good over time. As one more specific example, when we talk about like this notion of being shovel ready, which is something that we often lean on when we're creating policies, and it's like, okay, let's just get the money out the door so that we can get services to our community or get that particular point of enterprise, kind of built. But when we lean on like the shovel ready approach, what that does, what we don't often realize is that often is inherently inequitable, unjust, when you're kind of dealing in a context where the investment has not been there for folks to actually build the ecosystem of different enterprises necessary to actually be in position for that fast investment, right? So what that means is that we also have to think in terms of the political process, like how do we actually make it cool and more tolerable to create more space to build ecosystems, to build lasting institutions, and see that as our first step. So as we talk about this issue of, I saw one of the comments pop up around the issue of dispensaries, which is a really great one, where you have these dispensaries popping up everywhere around Baltimore, and they are not led by a person of color, a person from Baltimore. That is a telltale sign that something is wrong in terms of the structure of resources and who's in position to actually kind of bring them in. So I just wanted to lift that up because I know that that political pressure is also often a part of what happens in Baltimore. And we see, like, we ain't that old, Davon, Shauna, and like even in the past, like 10 years, the number of investment opportunities that almost pass us by in Baltimore because there's this political pressure to like move fast, and we end up making big mistakes. So we're here in the spirit of learning from that history and those patterns to say we can do better. And one very practical thing that we can do in order to do better is to create space for building the strength of institutions and seeing that as a win, as seeing that as an actual point of success, right? And then moving into the phase of the work that actually brings direct investment to those entities and those institutions to deliver services to our communities, right? So I just wanted to lift that up as well.
Yep. No, definitely thank y'all for that. So as we turn to conclude, and I'll ask you and Shauna, Daniel and Shauna, for y'all to maybe make some closing remarks in a few moments. I want to address again, there are three aspects of LBS's approaches to the cannabis legalization piece that are going to be important. What we talked about tonight was the community reinvestment aspect of it. I alluded to the criminal justice piece that, again, we're going to talk about on Saturday, Black Legislative Agenda Day. The other piece are the business opportunities, right? And that's a place that is tremendously complex. And one of the things that I want to say about the business opportunity piece, and while LBS will weigh in on that, one of the things that it's an unfortunate conclusion in terms of licensing, that in the place where the biggest money is are the dispensaries, the growers and dispensaries. And because of the level of disparity in access to capital, that it's capital intensive, right, to get to that aspect of the industry. Because it's still federally illegal, access to federal financial help and support isn't accessible, right? So it creates an environment where well-capitalized white folks and institutions are able to be most in position to get access to those licenses. So there's a broader question of wealth disparity that needs to be addressed so that when there are major opportunities, industries from which we should control and benefit from, there's a general question of being able to have the infrastructure to operationalize equity as it relates to being able to get access to those resources, right? So there isn't really very many government interventions that could be done in the short term to create more opportunities at the highest level for Black folks to participate at the dispensary and grower level. Now, not that there isn't any, right? So for instance, there are ways in which the legislature could require equity stake of Black-owned businesses to be a part of the process of selecting folks who get licenses, for instance, right? But again, that still doesn't address the entirety of the major wealth question that creates a barrier. One of the things we will advocate for is that there's certain aspects of the industry that are less capital intensive: transportation, security, consumption zones. Those are places that are less capital intensive, and that we will be pushing so that the legislation provides incentives for and advantages for Black folks who are interested in those parts of the business to be able to have preferential treatment. Now, that legally is complicated because there's an entire debate around racial preferences. That's something that often folks that don't want to be equitable and don't want to be redistributive hide behind in order to keep from pushing policies that make sure resources go into the hands of Black folks. But there is a precedent for being able to, surmount that obstacle. But just giving you the context for that particular piece of the advocacy around the business piece. Again, we're going to talk more about that on Saturday as well, that business side of it. But just wanted to mention that because I saw a bunch of comments and questions around the licensing piece, which is separate but related. So in turning to conclude, again, I want to thank everybody for taking the time to be with us to talk about this community reinvestment piece. And again, for me, this is so essential. Like I said, I was having conversations with legislators over the past several months. And one of the things that just became clear to me is that folks are going to look for cannabis legalization in Maryland to be some model for racial justice. And we have to make sure that folks have the information they need to make sure we get it right, to make sure they can actually have the biggest impact that it can have in terms of repairing the harm that's been done to Black people as a result of war on drugs. And one other thing I also want to say about LBS's particular advocacy on the policy side of this is that, unfortunately, as I mentioned, many of the traditional nonprofits have positioned themselves to be experts on the social equity piece. And I think because of the great support that we get from, many of our partners in the community, it's put us in a position to be able to sound the alarm on this particular issue in a way that, unfortunately, other states haven't been able to do. So if we're able to get this community reinvestment part right in Maryland, this is something that can have impacts that reverberate around the country. And so I think it's going to be very important for folks to continue, to support the work that we're doing legislatively. So, Adam's going to talk a little bit about sustainers, but I just want to make sure I make it a point to just explain why this particular perspective is such a unique perspective on this issue that unfortunately has not been represented in the cannabis legalization, social equity landscape, if you will. So with that, what I'll do is I'll kick it to Daniel and Shauna if y'all have any closing remarks, and then after that, Adam will take us away.
One of the things that was coming up for me, Davon, as you were talking about the business piece, mental health professionals and wellness professionals are also, right? That's a whole nother realm of business for mental health professionals around the relationship between cannabis usage and its aid to addressing mental health issues. And what we know already in health and wellness, right, is that Black folks tend to not be offered these sort of like alternative opportunities for healing and wellness, but it also has to do with, if Black folks want to go to Black providers and therapists, and there are so few, how many Black providers will be able to offer these resources around cannabis to be able to address issues like anxiety and depression that we know the data offers support for. So that came up for me as I was thinking about, just how few Black therapists and mental health professionals there are, and the relationship that would have when we're thinking about sort of a liberation focused healing and how to really ground in that way. My underlying closing remark is just it's super important for us to do some imaginative work, and to do that now as we are revving up for this next session, for the folks that are watching to begin to think about what an ideal system might be, and to challenge ourselves not only to critique the current system that exists, but to begin to put the pieces together of if anything could happen, what might it be? And to start to talk to folks in community about that, so that as these resources come, we have folks that are actually interested. We're not stammering to be able to find folks to be able to take advantage of the good work and success that we will see as a result of all this hard work. So yeah, that's all I had to say about that.
So all that I would add is that, my hope for this conversation and continued conversation around this topic and other related topics is that we take advantage of the opportunity to look at this through a generational frame. So often we'll talk about these these to me represent like opportunity moments, or like they're particular initiatives or policy kind of pushes that we can make in a particular moment. But all of what we do should map into a longer range kind of vision and strategy for what we are trying to build. And I'm talking about 10, 20, 30 years down the line, and actually for the next generation. if we start there, then everything else should start to make sense. Like, where does this particular push fit into that larger context? As Shauna has encouraged us to even think about, how does it fit into our historical context, like that notion of like ancestral kind of wisdom, and then where are we trying to go, and where does that kind of place us, like we're in this particular moment. The other point that I wanted to raise is just around reinvestment. There, sometimes when we get to the technical work, like the work of building, folks almost get into a space where it's almost like we believe that it has to be dry, it has to be boring, but this is actually work of that is imaginative, is creative, and that really needs us to be in that kind of imaginative space in order to build the type of institutions we need to get to where we need to go, right? In order for our spaces to become more generative and more in healing in nature, we're going to have to really think differently about how we organize ourselves. So that's what, whether it's a, kind of a charitable structure, whether we're talking about business structures. I saw the reference to cooperative structures. There are a lot of different tools for us to draw from to really reimagine how we organize ourselves, how we relate to one another, and how we share resources. So I just want to, kind of put that out there in terms of a hope that we continue to cultivate these spaces to really talk about what that can look like, so that we can build our own reinvestment platforms. So again, thank you for this conversation, and I look forward to joining y'all again.
All right. Beautiful. Thank you again to Davon, Shauna, and Danielle for the fantastic and informative conversation tonight. People who are unfamiliar with me, I know you saw me pop up like Batman earlier in the broadcast. But my name is Adam Jackson. I'm the Chief Executive Officer for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. And if this is your first time locking in to a conversation, this is how we get. We don't play games. We get straight into the information. Wasn't no pleasantries in the beginning. We ain't do all that. We came with the information, not that we just think about, but that we're actively doing in the legislature and in community in Baltimore. So I have two things to give to you before we log off tonight. First is that, like Davon said, this Saturday is our 8th annual Black Legislative Agenda Day. So it's going to be about 3 hours long. I know that sounds like a long time. Like, Adam, you want me to sit in front of a computer for 3 hours? Yes, because one, it's COVID, so we're doing it virtually. But also, secondly, we're going to have a variety of Black leaders from around the state of Maryland who are going to be talking about issues that impact you. Not just, what do we think about X issue, literally things that are going to be happening from January to April during the 2022 Maryland General Assembly. And these are people who are going to be talking about a range of topics. We're talking about criminal justice issues, immigration, a variety of things. And so that starts at 11 a.m. on Saturday. If this is your first time coming to an LBS event and you're like, man, I want to figure out how to get updated, if you look on the bottom of the screen, you can go follow, double tap, and people are doing social media days. All of our social media channels at LBS Ball, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And from there, you'll get all the updates about the work that we're currently doing. And you can also subscribe to see future broadcasts for events like these. Second thing I want to say to you, if you look, because this thing's in reverse, if you look above me right here on the screen, lbsbaltimore.com/sustain. Part of the reason that we encourage people to give resources to our organization on a monthly basis is because people always say that, how do we speak unapologetically about the issues that are impacting our community? How do we fund and sustain the work that we're doing? And reason why we tell people to donate is because, look, if you give us $10 a month over the course of a year, that'll last us eons more and eons longer than a white foundation giving us $50,000 time to an atlas or to do advocacy work in our community. We see our institution as powered by you. And so if you can only give as little as $5 to $10 a month, fantastic. If you can give $50 a month, fantastic. But just know that when we use the people's money, we advocate for the people in the halls of power. And so it's Giving Tuesday. Don't just give back, give black. #give black. You feel me? You need to go to lbsbaltimore.com/sustain and just sign up. It's easy. You can do it while you listen to this broadcast. You sign up. I think it's cheaper than Netflix, Hulu. You already sign up for all the streaming services. I know COVID hurt your pockets. You signed up for HBO Max, Showtime, Cinemax, you can sign up to support a Black grassroots organization in Baltimore advocating for you. So go to lbsbaltimore.com/sustain. And again, do not miss the 2021 Black Legislative Agenda Day. That's happening this Saturday at 11 a.m. lbsbaltimore.com to sign up and register. It's free. It's open to the public. You don't have to pay anything. And all you're going to get lots of information. In addition to the grassroots organizers and activists, you're going to hear straight from Black legislators as well. And so all of these things are going to be happening throughout the course of Saturday afternoon. And we highly encourage you to come. This is not just about talking at you. We're talking at you on the computer screen because this is how we have to get down right now. But when it comes time to advocate for these issues in Annapolis, we're going to be live and in color. Black people out in Annapolis advocating for ourselves. So I encourage you, join us on Saturday, become a sustainer, give Black, you know what I mean? And stay awesome, stay healthy, stay beautiful. And I appreciate y'all for joining us tonight. Everyone on YouTube and Facebook. We'll see you next time, all right? Peace.